been asked to speak about the cultivation of mental and emotional balance, which I imagine many of us, perhaps even all of us here, are interested in already. But I'm quite sure that everyone is interested in having a clear mind, having mental well-being, emotional well-being, a sense of health. And the implication here in the title is that balance is a key to both mental and emotional balance. So how do we go about cultivating that? I would suggest the key is attention. I think we all know from our own experience that our own minds can be our worst enemies. They can drive us mad. While sitting quietly in a room with no stimuli from the environment at all, we can be abjectly miserable just by the rumination, the thoughts going through our minds, getting caught up, snared in the grip of what psychologists call rumination. In other words, we know we can be miserable all by ourselves with no help from outside. It's an inside job. And many, but perhaps not all people, know that it's also possible to be sitting quietly in your chambers, quietly in a cave, quietly in a serene place in nature, and with little or no stimulation from the environment, to have a sense of being truly well, happy. And you look around and think, what's making me happy? And you can't find anything outside. That sense of well-being is coming from inside. So we should all be Sherlock Holmes here, tracing this to the source. Now, in this marvelous presentation I had the luck of being able to listen to off stage, causation, the agent, was uniformly attributed to the brain. And there's no question the brain is implicated in all of our subjective experience. But the notion that the only true explanation is a neurological one, and I never heard the speaker, Professor Ramachandran, say that, I think is limited. Sometimes we may have a brighter light shed on what's going on in subjective experience by looking into subjective experience itself, looking for a psychological explanation. So I suggested that attention is the key. A person who can control his attention, his or her attention, can control the type of reality that person has a sense of experiencing and living. For after all, as William James, the great pioneer of modern psychology, stated, for the moment what we attend to is reality. We take seriously, we count as real only that which we attend to. So when our minds are caught up in attention hyperactivity, whether or not it's clinically diagnosed, I think we all know what it's like. When the mind is like a runaway train, like an elephant in rut, to use one of the great Indian classic metaphors, it can give us an enormous amount of grief, especially when this rumination, this obsessive, compulsive flow of thinking is negative, dwelling on past misfortunes, the misbehavior of other people, negativities of one sort or another, and they just catch us in their claws. We really become victims of our own minds. So negative rumination, if we're looking for mental balance, emotional balance, insofar as our minds are still prone to such negative rumination, such attention hyperactivity, where the mind really is out of control, and we're kind of just being dragged along in its wake, then as long as we are prone to that, or to the extent that we are prone to that, mental and emotional balance will be an unreachable ideal. I call this OCDD, this tendency, not to be confused with the OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is clinically diagnosed. The OCDD will not show up in the current version, the 5th version of the Encyclopedia of Mental Diseases, DSM, probably because all of the editors of DSM have it, as do most, if not all of us here in the audience. And so I call it obsessive compulsive delusional disorder. Right? But see how familiar it sounds. Obsessive, and then in a sense that when you would like to be just quiet, there's really nothing you need to think about, nothing you need to think about. You would like to be quietly present, simply attending to your body, your mind, the environment, another person. You can't, because the mind is like a chatterbox. It's always got something to say. Obsessively, thoughts are flowing out one after another. And as much as you would love to turn it off, at least have a brief respite once in a while, a bit of quiet in the chamber of your mind. It does not give you that option. It always has an answer. You want to be quiet? Good, let's talk about it. It's obsessive. If you think you have control, try to not think for 1 minute while you're still awake. It's obsessive. Well, as if that's not enough, it's also compulsive. That is, the thoughts arise, but they don't simply arise like images on a television screen. They arise, and we generally are compulsively drawn into them, as if there's a siphon. It sucks our attention in, and our attention is focused off to the referent of the thought. We are there and then thinking about this and that. There's a really awful image. It was in that movie, Little Miss Sunshine. Remember where they tied the dog to the back of the station wagon and then forgot? Yeah, it was a comedy, so don't worry, no animals were harmed in that sequence. But nevertheless, we're the dog, and the rumination is the station wagon. It draws us in. It drags us along. Does that resonate with your experience? But it's worse than that. Obsessive would be bad enough. Compulsive is even worse, but it gets worse. It's delusional. And that is when we get caught in the vortex of this kind of flow of rumination, the general tendency, and see for yourself, I'm not trying to tell you what your experience is like, I'm making a generalization here, see whether the shoe fits, that we tend to take seriously whatever we're thinking, even though we're not really thinking it, it's thinking us. The dog is not driving the car. But is it not true that when we're thinking about something, fixating, ruminating, obsessing about something, that there's a general tendency to think, I think, therefore it's true. Psychologists call that a refractory period, where the mind gets caught in the grip of an emotion, a memory, a desire, and we can't see outside of that filter system. If I'm ruminating negatively about some person, resentment is arising, maybe contempt or disgust is arising towards that person. Insofar as as long as I'm in the flow of that rumination, that obsessive compulsive delusional disorder, I cannot imagine that person has any good qualities, or even any neutral qualities. The neutral look bad and the good are simply invisible. Whereas the bad, they come out in three-dimensional high def. Vivid, in fact, exaggerated, off the charts. So obsessive, compulsive, delusional, that sounds pretty bad, and if it weren't so ubiquitous, it would definitely be in the DSM. But there it is. Attention hyperactivity, that's the nice short term for it. Not a sign of mental health. We've gotten used to it, but that's the only reason it's tolerable. A lot of things are tolerable if you simply get accustomed to it. Sexism, racism, and many, many other aberrations of the human mind and spirit seem to be tolerable simply because we're habituated to them. Right. Well, it's exhausting. We all know what that's like, isn't it? Just being caught from one rumination to another takes away our happiness during the daytime, and when we're finally tired, we can't fall asleep because we don't know how to turn it off. It keeps on going and going, and it says, I know you're tired, but that's breaks. I'm dragging you until you are unconscious. And even in the course of the day, it's just exhausting, isn't it? We've experienced it's fatiguing, it's stressful. That's why there's mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's massage, there's various types of therapy to just give it a rest, be able to recover, at least a bit of first aid to all the damage we're doing ourselves. And of course, we're not doing it to ourselves, otherwise we'd stop. It's just sheer habit. I'm sure there are neurological correlates, but I'm not sure identifying those is really going to help. So when we get exhausted, then we fall into attention deficit, where we may be at a board meeting, we may be students in a classroom, maybe be at work, we may be driving, and so forth and so on, watching television, reading a book, and you all know what it's like, don't you? Attention deficit. You like to be focused, and the mind just isn't up to it. Your attention isn't up to it. It's just sitting there, spinning its wheels, not engaged. You can even be having a conversation with your spouse, and your spouse says, what do you think? And you say, what? What? AWOL on reality. Out of sheer exhaustion. Out of sheer exhaustion. So even though ADHD is clinically diagnosed, and of course the medical profession is very keen to drug it into submission, that doesn't cure it. I know it can be very helpful, and it's necessary for some people, but wouldn't it be marvelous if from childhood on, for our own children, our children's children, If given the hectic pace of modernity, the multitasking, the sensory bombardment, the information bombardment of cell phones and internet and television and radio and text messaging and everything else, even the entertainment, it's almost like getting in the ring with a prize fighter, getting beaten into submission. Wouldn't it be marvelous if for our children, since my generation, even the next generation down and the generation up, has created this world, this is kind of like an ADHD world. Wouldn't it be marvelous if we could provide our children with kind of a psychological immunization to help prevent them from falling into ADHD, succumbing to that which the whole environment is screaming for, entropy of the mind? So how? Drugs like Ritalin, Adderall treat the symptoms, which makes you drug dependent and you get into the habit, maybe even from the early age. If you have a psychological problem, just find the drug. In other words, when it comes to drug, just say yes. Just say yes. Think of yourself as a brain and think of any psychological problem as a brain disorder, and you've got the conclusion. The way to treat it is just say yes to the drug. I find that as valuable as psychopharmaceutical drugs can be, I find this a mind-numbing limitation to think that's the only way. Remedy. If we're really looking for mental balance, emotional balance, which I think we all are, or at least well-being, how can we train this wild beast of attention to bring balance to it? So when we'd like to be quiet, we have that option. When we'd like to just go into free flow, daydreaming, we have that option. Like to think creatively, analytically, like to dwell on the past, anticipate the future, we have that option. And when we like to be just quiet, attentive, receptive, in a conversation with a child, a friend, a spouse, business meeting, education, and so forth, just to like to be totally silent. I don't mean zoning out, I mean present, discerningly, but just taking in reality rather than insisting that it be a dialogue at all times. How? As we had the eminent Professor Ramachandran from Indian background speaking paradigmatically from the Western scientific perspective, with its great strength and emphasis on understanding the objective, the physical, the quantifiable. Now I will just turn the tables as an Anglo and speak from the classical Indian perspective. How do you develop attention skills? How do you develop attentional balance? India, I think, is actually the foremost civilization on the planet in terms of just the centuries of research they've done, and it's called samadhi. Not in some sense of some kind of a pinpoint, minute tunnel vision, not at all. It's just useful occasionally, just like looking through a telescope. But rather attentional balance. What's the first step? First step is, can you learn how to relax? It's a skill. It's a skill to be cultivated. To set your body at ease, to set your mind at ease, to unwind. So many of us are like an overinflated tire. You know, how can you just get a pin and put it in the valve and go, you know, relax, baby. You know, it'll be okay. But you need to unwind first. If you take that wound up, tense, driven, strained, ego-driven, goal-oriented mind and say, okay, give me some meditation, I'll suck it. I'll get that little bugger. I'll master that too. I'm going to be really good at meditation. I'll just give it my best shot. I'll master that little sucker, whatever it is, you know. Well, lots of luck with that. The first thing is actually not to master anything, it's actually let go. It's not to acquire anything or to achieve anything. The first thing is to let go. Release all the rumination as much as you can, breath by breath, every out-breath. Let it be a surrender, a happy surrender. A release of the breath, a release of bodily tension, a release of rumination, breath by breath. Bring your awareness back to the present moment, not with a tight-fistedness, but with a relaxation, a release. It's a skill to be cultivated. We should be teaching it to our children from preschool on, because they are already being indoctrinated how to seize up. And they will learn it well. How to get the job done, but with tension, with gripping, with effort, with ego. They will learn that lesson for sure. We need some immune shots for them to help them balance out. For them, for us perhaps too. So the first point is relaxation, loosening up. releasing into the present moment. And then once you've kind of come there, like, oh, hello, reality, because after all, the past is no longer exists. The future doesn't yet. So if you're interested in reality, you know where to find it. It's in between. It's what hasn't yet passed and hasn't and isn't the future. What is happening right now, that's where the goods are. And so to release into that, and then to stabilize, to find that literally that presence of mind, and then stabilize there. To find some inner stillness, stability, composure, collectedness, or the Sanskrit term samadhi, which is now part of English language also, unification of the mind. Get your act together in the present moment. Focused, stable, relaxed. For all teachers in the room, wouldn't it be marvelous if you, when you stepped into the classroom to begin a class, if all of your students were prepped, relaxed, stable, the teacher is entering the room. They might actually learn something. So far, so good. Relaxed, stable, still, but not enough. Has to be some clarity there. Clarity, vividness, high acuity, brightness of the mind. So that we're attending clearly and closely to whatever we wish to direct the attention to, whether it's studying, whether it's creative, whether it's driving a car, whether it's talking with a loved one, or talking with a person who's not such a loved one, but being totally attentive. There's the key. They can all be cultivated, and there is a sequence to it. First, relaxation, then stability, and then vividness. I'd like to see the monitor. Thank you. There's some prizes in store when you actually venture into that kind of practice. And anybody can do it, religious, not religious. You don't even really have to be interested in meditation, let alone India, Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth. You don't need to be interested in all of that, any of that. If you like to, that's cool. All you need to be interested in is finding a sense of inner well-being, of tensional balance, which then you can apply to every other endeavor that you engage in, including falling asleep. That when you lie down in bed, you're tired, you're ready for sleep. That actually is an option. Because when you relax, you let your mind come to stillness. And then you can release the clarity as you drift off into sleep. So finding peace of mind, an inner peace of mind, predictable, because we know what the opposite is. When mind is caught up in rumination, obsessive, compulsive, delusional thinking, the refractory period, it's not pleasant. But there's a surprise in store, big surprise, a discovery that I think, if it's been made at all, it's been marginal in terms of modern mind sciences, but it's perhaps one of the most important discoveries yet to be made, scientifically, about the nature of the mind, and that is when you find just attentional balance, let alone the other aspects of mental balance, and there are others. But simply by cultivating attentional balance, relaxation, stability, clarity, it's not only a sense of peace and inner calm that arises. Lo and behold, you start to enjoy the practice. It could be just mindfulness of breathing, which is not intrinsically some pleasant act. It's observing quite neutral sensations. But it's not that the breathing itself becomes pleasurable, it's the quality of awareness that is arising to this neutral task, and a sense of well-being, beyond peace, serenity, a sense of real happiness, a sense of flourishing, that's not coming from what you're getting from the world, it's coming from what you're bringing to the world. Quality of attentional balance, the first step towards mental balance. And the Greeks had a term for this. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they called it eudaimonia, genuine happiness, human flourishing. Aristotle called it the being at work of the soul in accordance with virtue, and should there be more than one virtue, in accordance with the highest virtue. Eudaimonia, a sense of well-being that is not stimulus-driven, for which you don't need a companion, you don't need entertainment, you don't even need work, you don't even need happy thoughts to keep you perky. It's a quality of awareness itself. It's actually a symptom of mental health. As a symptom of physical injury or disease is you feel bad. And a symptom of mental imbalance is you feel bad, as you should. It's really good that you feel bad when you're mentally imbalanced. Otherwise, you'll have no incentive to find mental balance. Don't kill the messenger. And that's my gripe against the overuse of psychopharmaceutical drugs. Kill the messenger, that'll do it. enriching the pharmaceutical industry, but impoverishing everybody becomes drug dependent. So eudaimonia, a sense of well-being that arises from within, that comes from what we bring to the world rather than what we derive from it. So one of the questions I was asked to address is, how do our desires and impulses, how do they affect our well-being, our psychological stature? And I would suggest that insofar as we are investing, almost as if we had a bank portfolio or investment portfolio, insofar as we're investing our time, our energy, our creativity, our aspirations and goals purely into hedonic pleasure, the good life equals being really lucky every day. Achieved by way of greater and greater acquisition, wealth and everything that money can buy. Achieved by acquiring other people's esteem, their regard, their acknowledgement, their respect, their appreciation, their love. Achieved by achieving status, power, influence, knowing you really are somebody. Insofar as our life's agenda is focused single-mindedly upon the pursuit of hedonic pleasure, the pleasure that we can get from the world around us, from wealth, from other people, from work, from this and that, from the environment around us, then I think any kind of durable emotional balance, once again, will be out of reach. For a very simple reason. The world is largely out of our control. Other people's behavior, even our own spouses. I don't want to control my spouse's behavior, but if I tried, I know it's not going to be an option. If there's a spouse, strong commitment between two people for years, more than 2 decades now, but I don't control her behavior, she doesn't control mine. That's part of the delight of having a meaningful relationship. So what is there in terms of aspirations, desires, goals, one could even say, apart from the hedonic, the good life equated with affluence and so forth? And to factor into one's life's vision, certainly there's a role for hedonic well-being, meeting your material needs, food, clothing, shelter, medical care when you need it, education for your children, all these very important. But also envisioning wherein lies my genuine happiness. How can I cultivate such a sense of well-being that is not contingent upon the world going my way, according to my desires? I think factoring that into one's vision of one's own flourishing, the good life, what will truly make me happy, is actually, together with attentional balance, a key to emotional balance. In other words, mature. Mature in terms of your desires. We no longer have childish desires. We don't wish for a new fire truck or want to be a cowboy when we grow up. Not at our age, I presume, unless you're a really good cowboy. You know? But let your aspirations mature into wisdom, like the wisdom of Socrates, the Buddha, Shankara, Zhuangzi, and so forth. All the great wisdom traditions of the world, religious and non-religious. Aristotle's not known as a religious man per se, great philosopher. Socrates the same. All the great wisdom traditions of the world all have, with variations to be sure, a vision of eudaimonia that is more than simply stimulus-driven pleasure. And I'm not kicking stimulus-driven pleasure. It's just that we don't have that much control, right? Even the wealthiest may die early death because of some disease, or have an injury, or have a marriage that cracks up and leaves them in misery. Marriage? Wealth? Fame? Think you can control it with that? Don't think so. So, to envision, how can I transform myself? And will there be brain correlates? Yes, they will tag along. They will tag along, the brain correlates. But how you actually bring about such maturation, a growth of wisdom, a ripening experience of eudaimonia, is not by interjecting things into your brain. Because that, frankly, is meaningless. If somebody just puts a drug in your brain, that's not a meaningful activity. But lead a meaningful life. Well, that's meaningful because your life is meaningful, because your actions are meaningful, because your attitudes are meaningful. Neurons aren't meaningful. They're chemicals. Very complex to be sure, but they're still chemicals. There's nothing inside the brain except for chemicals and electricity. So we should avoid, I think, sometimes mythologizing the brain. It's chemicals and electricity with incredible complexity. The mind is no less a wondrous thing. And there is no evidence yet that the mind and brain are the same. If there is some, I'd love to see it. So in terms of finding emotional well-being, balancing, a hedge fund. That is, we still need to give, as in the Christian tradition, give unto Caesar Caesar's due. Attend to the hedonic as much as necessary, and it is necessary. But then what was the point? St. Augustine, to quote St. Thomas Aquinas, another Christian mastermind, said the whole point of the political life, that is, all pursuits of hedonic well-being, are all for the sake of the contemplative life, all for the sake of a meaningful life, the cultivation of genuine happiness. Now, in the midst of this, it's not enough simply to refine one's attention skills, to develop the kind of contemplative technology, relaxation, stability, vividness, but then we need to bring this to life, to attend closely, to pay attention, to give reality our best. And this means to let that bright light of attention shine upon our own minds so that we are aware when thoughts, images, desires, emotions arise. We have this metacognitive awareness which gives the option, the possibility of making wise choices when an impulse arises. That we're not simply sucked up into every impulse, every desire, every thought that comes up and acting robotically. But actually we see an impulse coming up and then we can make a choice. Is that a wise impulse? Is it a beneficial impulse? Will it be good for me and others or not? And have the option of making a wise choice. So cognitive balance. We can understand cognitive balance by identifying cognitive imbalance. Cognitive hyperactivity is where we are attending to a person, a situation, even our own minds, with such presuppositions, such projection, such interpretation, over-interpretation, that we can hardly see what's going on because we are over-interpreting, hearing things that aren't said, seeing things that are not displayed. We're living in our own little world that we're projecting on reality. It's delusional. Cognitive hyperactivity. Cognitive deficit, once again, we're just withdrawn. We're disengaged. We're not attentive. We're not present with our children, with our spouses, with our colleagues. We're just not present. So to be clearly present, attending to other people's body language, their facial expressions, what they say, how they say it, the quality of voice, the speed with which they speak. Attending closely. A friend of mine, Lawrence Freeman, dear friend, Benedictine monk, said the greatest gift we can give to another person is our attention. The word attention comes from the Latin root, means to tend to care for, watch over, and look after. It says we tend to others. Tend closely, let them become real for us. Naturally and inevitably, a sense of empathy arises. And the neural correlates, jolly good, mirror neurons. But you don't cultivate empathy by knowing about mirror neurons. It's very useful, I'm sure. But you cultivate empathy by attending closely to others until they really become real for you, not as a means to your own end, but they are real. Each one as real. Each one is worthy. Each one is precious. Each one aspiring for happiness and freedom from suffering, just as we are. So we bring this mindfulness, this close attentiveness, this cognitive balance inwardly to clearly experience our own bodies, the sense, the experience of being embodied. Attending closely to our own minds. You won't see your brain there, but you will see an amazing array of mental phenomena, which are correlated in a mysterious way, because I don't think there's a scientist alive who yet knows the exact nature of the mind-brain correlations. It is a mystery, sometimes shrouded in assumptions, which I think doesn't serve the scientific community or anybody else well, to simply assume that they are the same, because that's never been demonstrated. The correlates are brilliant, and scientists of the eminence, the ingenuity, the genius, one could say, of Professor Ramachandran, they're highlighting these amazing correlations. But what we don't know is what's the nature of the correlation. So until we do, why don't we just hold that in space? And attend closely inwardly, attend closely outwardly. Developing a real sense of empathy towards ourselves, which is just the opposite of low self-esteem. Attending closely to ourselves, which is just the opposite of narcissism. Attend closely to others, which lays the cognitive basis for empathy. And empathy being the basis for truly caring about others, as we care for ourselves. And that's the basis for loving kindness and compassion. As we attend to those who are near, those who are far, we find we can't help it. We just start caring more. A sense of wish, of the longing for others' well-being, that they may be free of suffering, just arises naturally, simply because we're attending closely. And there's the key to emotional balance. the big mind, big space of the mind, that everyone around you, near and far, they're all real to you. And there you find emotional balance. So your own well-being is actually inextricably linked with the well-being of all of those around you. And there's the key to mental balance, emotional balance, and I'm finished.